Here is Diplomat Moss Green, a green ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
This is a really good, solid, basic green that is almost always looking good on the page. There is some minor tone variation by pen, and it does tend to shade very nicely. I do enjoy a good green ink. Now, on non-fountain pen friendly paper, it is a 50-50 on if you're going to get good performance, though the tone will always be nice. I can easily see being happy if I was given this as a gift and being very happy using that bottle, but I probably wouldn't buy a bottle of this myself for however it is that you want to interpret that. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with a fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
The pen for today is a Duke 209.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the extra fine nib, we get a nice mid-tone of green with no feathering, with no spread, with some light shading that's going on. You can really see it where glowing on the first line is a bit darker than and to the left of it. Now bundles underneath starts darker on the B, lightens up during the U into the ND. It's the LES at the end that does get a bit darker. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade from a nice dark green to a darker green. Take a look at small and pine, both on the first line. Small is mostly one tone and it's a nice dark green, where pine gets even darker. Now, as far as shading within the words, look at hand on the second line, where the H is very dark. The A, N, and beginning of the D are lightened up a little bit. It's the end of the D that does get very dark. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, I think, a little bit better than it did with the medium. Now, I described them as the same tone because you see the same mid and the same dark tones back and forth, but you see more of those mid-tones, making the shading a bit more obvious here. You see the touch on the first line where the T is lighter than the he, which follows, and the T of touch is a little darker than the OU, where the H is very dark at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It doesn't really shade here though. This is a bit more absorbent paper and it is eating up that shading, just leaving a very nice green on the page though. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread and it does not shade. Again, the shading's being eaten up by the absorbency of the paper, though we still get a great green tone. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. However, it is shading where it didn't really do that with the medium. It definitely is here. Take a look at tunnel on the first line, where the T is lighter, TU is lighter than the first N, which is quite dark. The next NE are a nice mid-tone, where the L at the end very dark. And you can see this happen quite a bit, like they on the second line. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that it did get quite deep into the page, especially with the medium. I'm not sure if you would want to write on the back of the page here. However, on the stub and the extra fine, there was no issue, and you could easily write back here, though none of it bled through touching the page underneath. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine, giving me the idea that this is a rather opaque ink. It doesn't seem to really be affected by the tone of the paper. Now, it does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Take a look at holding on the second line, where the H is quite a bit darker than the rest of the old. The ing at the end does get a bit darker again. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does feather. I mean, you see it in many of the words. It doesn't spread. It doesn't shade. So I'm going to say in general, if you can live with this feathering, then it's going to be perfectly good. I would choose a different ink from a medium nib on this paper. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. It does feather, it does spread. Now, the feathering is about what you get with the medium, and so it is going to be your tolerance for feathering on whether or not this really works. There is some shading that's going on. It's very minor in what's going on. I'm much more drawn to the feather. For me, it's very distracting. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that the ink got very deep into the paper the whole way through. I don't think you could take notes back here. I think you would destroy both sides. Now, when we look at the page underneath, once again, we have a lot of dots coming through, and I'm just going to go ahead and skip that page for the next review. It bleeds through and touches those pages. Very unfortunate. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left. Pen flush is on the top right. 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left. And water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It does stand out from the quad rule with no problem, making this a very strong ink to be using on this page, especially I would think with a nice purple. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, maybe just a little bit more. Now, if you look at the word description on the third line, you can see that the D is a nice mid-tone where the E darkens up a little bit. The S begins lighter and then gets darker. The CRI are pretty light, where that P very dark. The T starts to lighten up again, and the shun at the end, a little bit lighter. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It does stand out against this quad rule very well, making this a strong contender to be used on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Aurora Green. Here is Diamine Kelly Green. Here is Krishna Shamrock. Here is Noodler's Texas Live Oak. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, It is the same tone as the Clairfontaine, where often this paper will dull an ink when it goes down. It didn't do it here. It's a very nice, vivid green. No feathering, no spread. It shades not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but it does shade. Take a look at light on the third line, where the LIG are a nice lighter tone. The HT at the end do get quite a bit darker. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade very well, where it wasn't doing it so, especially well with the extra fine. Much better here. Take a look at splintered on the second line, where the SP are very dark. The LIN lighten up a little bit. That T gets darker into the E, the R light, the ED at the end, very dark again. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. A little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade very well. A real jewel on this paper. Take a look at jewel on the first line, where the JE are darker than the W, which lightened up quite a bit. The E gets a bit darker and the the E gets a bit darker. The L a little bit darker still. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Private Reserve Shoreline Gold.
Here is Noodler's Purple.
Here is Thornton's Black. Here is Sailor Fire Red.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the horror show, that is the extra fine nib. It is a bit darker than it was with the Clairfontaine. It does feather horribly. It spreads horribly. Shading, who cares? This is unusable to me in here. It's very distracting and I wouldn't want it. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread, and who cares about shading? This is not a usable combination. And what I'm seeing here, it just seems that Diplomat inks don't like 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. It does feather, it does spread. Now, oddly, the feathering, while it's present, is not as bad as it was with the extra fine or with the medium, especially with that medium. Makes it much better to use here. Now, the spread is occurring, but it's not the end of the world. I think this is much more usable than it was with the extra fine or the medium. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that there is no taking notes back here, because if you did, you'd destroy both sides. So lots of ghosting, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The extra fine was the lightest tone and shaded very well. Now, the medium and the stub were both darker than the extra fine, and both shaded very nicely from a dark green to a very dark green. This does always look good on the page, so it could have been a dealer's choice. However, I would really choose the slightly wet pen, because the darker tone is really great on the page. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.